These are not my notes for tonight. This is a little letter that I received from a mother of one of our listeners. The little girl's name is Kathy Long from Parma, Ohio. And the mother writes, Kathy, our little 2-year-old daughter thoroughly enjoys watching you. In fact, when it comes time to go to bed, you get many kisses as a good... She's 2 years old. Did you hear that, the first part? You get many kisses as a good night, and even then she wants to stay up. She sits in her rocker, almost spellbound during your entire talk. I wish you were on more frequently. A few weeks ago, in anticipation of a new arrival to the family, we purchased a new dryer. It is the type with a glass window in the front. Kathy watched me put the clothes in and saw them tumble around for a while. And then she turned to me with a puzzled look on her face and said, "But Mommy, where's Fishy Sheen?" I explained to her this was not television and that you were not on at this time anyway. She looked up and she says, "Mommy, I just love Fishy Sheen and Mickey Mouse." Fishy Sheen first and Mickey Mouse next. Well, I must say for little Kathy, she likes clean shows. In this telecast, the 3 greatest confessions of history: the confessions of Augustine, the confessions of Abelard and Heloise, and the confessions of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. We build them around the conflicts of the modern world. It is too generally assumed today that if any person has a conflict or an inner tension, that there's something abnormal about him. Now, it should be remembered that everyone has a tension. There's a very normal tension, that is to say, the tension between body and spirit. And then there's another tension, too, between what we are and what we ought to be. Now, in each of these confessions, there were tensions, there were falls, there was, in every instance, what our modern world would call a sex problem. And we will see how the problems were solved. First, Augustine. And this takes us back to the end of the 4th century. Augustine lived in northern Africa. Remember, the civilization of Carthage rivaled Rome. His father was unfaithful to his wife, was cruel, gave a very bad example about the house. The mother was a saint. He was brilliant. But as he said, I could not make a distinction between a pure affection and voluptuousness. I was devoured, he said, by the flesh. At the age of 17, in the year 371, he took unto himself a common law wife who lived with him for 14 years. We do not know her name. It's strange that in all the writings of Augustine, he should have left this woman unnamed. That year his father died. And this woman the following year gave birth to a son called a Deodatus, which means given by God. The mother was very distraught at the paganism of her son, and she went to see the bishop, and the bishop said, "A child of so many tears will never be lost." Well, on account of Augustine's wild, furious life, and this tension between body and soul in which the body had the mastery, like everyone else, he had to find a philosophy to justify the way that he lived. You see, if we do not live as we think, we soon begin to think as we live. So Augustine had to have a philosophy. And his philosophy that he chose was Manichaeanism. Now, Manichaeanism was a philosophy that believed that there's an absolute principle of good and an absolute principle of evil. He chose that philosophy because it relieved him of responsibility. After all, he could say, I'm determined to be the way that I am, hence I need not be good. His mother had always prayed that he would never go to Italy. But after a brilliant career at the University of Carthage, he went to Italy. And when he went to Rome, the prefect of Rome was a certain Symmachus. And Symmachus was very anxious to restore paganism in Rome. The imperial court was then in Milan. Symmachus thought, well, the very best person in all the world to send to plead the cause of paganism at the imperial court is this brilliant scholar and rhetorician, Augustine. So Augustine is sent up to Milan. Three things happened in Milan. First, there was a great rhetorician in Milan. His name was Ambrose. He was the bishop of Milan. Augustine used to go and sit under the pulpit and listen to Ambrose. Then he visited him, borrowed books from his library, and Ambrose talked Augustine out of Manichaeanism. Then there came a second influence. Augustine picked up a work of Cicero that was called Hortensius. It no longer exists. All the manuscripts have disappeared. And when when Augustine read Hortensius, he said he became convinced of the beauty of contemplation. But as much as he wanted to philosophize, here was this flesh of his with all of its urges demanding satisfaction. He talked the matter over with a friend of his called Ponciatus, and Ponciatus recounted to him the story of St. Anthony of the desert. He said he had the same conflict you had. Everyone has. The flesh and the spirit. And he explained to Augustine how he overcame it by disciplining his flesh and finally making the spirit master. And Augustine began thinking it over, walked up and down in the garden. From an adjoining garden, he heard a child. The child was saying, "Tole et lege." Take and read. And Ponciatus had just been reading St. Paul. Augustine picked up the book in obedience to the injunction of the child. His eyes fell across the passage in the Romans about not in chamberings and impurities, but rather in complete consecration to God, making no provision for the flesh do we find peace. And Augustine decided then and there maybe the way of St. Anthony is the right way. April 22nd, the year 387, with his mother there, the woman that he had lived with for years, had returned to Africa to do a life of penance, Ambrose baptized Augustine and Archdioceses, who later on died. Archdioceses was then about 13. 12 years later, Augustine wrote what we already have told you, his Confession. The most soul-searching document that has ever been written. We think that we live in an age that has made many psychological discoveries. And believe me, we think many a thing is modern simply because we do not know what is ancient. Nobody can ever understand the real depths of psychology until he's read three great works. The Passions by Thomas Aquinas, The Concupiscence of Bossuet, and The Confessions of St. Augustine. Here was a man who resolved the conflict that is imminent in everyone and left us those words that immediately recall Augustine are almost scriptural. Our hearts were made for thee, O Lord, and they are restless until they rest in thee. That was one way of solving the conflict. Now another way. The time 700 years later, around the 1100s. The boy is tired of living on his father's farm at Nantes. He comes up from Nantes to Paris is one of the intellectual centers of the world. He's brilliant, skilled in speech. He decides to become a great philosopher and teacher, and great he did become. In those days, people talked philosophy just as we talk politics today. Just as in the 4th and 5th century they talked theology. Cyril of Alexandria had to get up one day in a pulpit in the 4th century and say to his people, I do not want you people talking the hypostatic union in barber shops. Can't you imagine some woman under a hairdryer talking about the hypostatic union today? Well, here in the Middle Ages, they were talking philosophy. Abelard was brilliant. He loved to debate. He went from one school to another. Finally came a great debate with William of Champeaux. The University of Paris was then being born. It was alongside of the Cathedral of Notre Dame. There was the cloisters, the portals. Not the present cathedral, but the one that just preceded it. The present cathedral was soon to be built. Thousands of students always came to listen to Abelard. He was almost invincible in discussion. One day when he was debating William of Champeaux, he was pleased looking out the heads of 2,000 or 3,000 students to see leaning against the cathedral door the rector of the Cathedral of Notre Dame, the builder of the future and present Cathedral of Notre Dame of Paris, Canon Fulbert. Canon Fulbert was holding a little 2-year-old niece of his by her hand. Abelard was 22. 16 years passed. Abelard is 38. Greater than ever. The little girl, Heloise, is now 18. Everyone spoke Latin. That was the language of the country. She spoke Greek, Hebrew, knew the scriptures, the fathers of the church philosophy. And so Canon Fulbert decides that this niece of his will be one of the most brilliant women in Europe. Who could better teach her philosophy than the great Abelard? So Abelard is invited to teach the beautiful Heloise. So the lessons begin. He talks about matter and form, substance and accident, the analogy of proportion, the analogy of proportionality, primary and secondary causes, and then he begins talking about beautiful June moon. How blue are her eyes, how brilliant her mind. And in the language of Shakespeare, Abelard loved her not wisely but too well. And to escape the shame of an unmarried mother, she went to Brittany. Canon Fulbert was furious, did violence to Abelard. Then began a long exchange of letters, and in those days, the men kept the letters. That's how he happened to have the Confessions of Heloise. Abelard himself wrote his own in the History of Calamities. See, things have changed. Remember in the gospel, it was the bridegroom who kept everyone waiting. Today, it's the bride. So in the letters, she argues with Abelard, and she tells Abelard that they should not be married. And she gives reasons. She knew the pagan classics well, knew the Greek philosophers well, and these were the three arguments. She said, you remember that when Cicero divorced his wife Terentia, he refused to take to himself another wife on the grounds that no man could ever devote himself to philosophy and to a wife at one and the same time. The second argument that she gave was, she says, how could you think with a house full of children? She said, does the pen with which you write, is it compatible with the playpen? We were rich, we could have many servants, but no philosopher is ever rich. And the domestic cares would not permit you to think as you should. And then the third argument that she gave was from wise old Socrates, the Greek philosopher who had the horrid wife called Xanthippe. Socrates afterwards said, if you He said, if you marry well, you'll be happy. If you do not marry well, you'll be a philosopher. He was. And so this particular day, Heloise told Abelard that Xantippe was scolding and thundering at Socrates, and Socrates in his meekness went out, sat on the stoop of their home. She went up on the second floor and poured out a barrel of slop down on Socrates' head. And Socrates looked up at her very calmly and said, I knew after all that thunder we'd have some rain. So Heloise said, you see, it's better not to marry. Well, they were married. And then Heloise is induced by Abelard to do penance and to enter a convent. And Abelard himself decides to do penance. It is never so very sure from the letters of Heloise that she entered the convent. The child later on died. That she ever entered the convent because she loved God. She entered the convent because Abelard wanted her to enter the convent. So it might seem, but we cannot judge. In any case, Abelard lost all of his popularity, lost his skill in debate, and was ignominiously routed by Bernard of Clairvaux. Time passes, 700 years, and the people of Paris, who always love a romance, brought the bodies of Heloise and of Abelard to Paris and buried them in the cemetery of Père Lachaise, where they are now, not so very far away, at least in the same city as the great cathedral at the portals of which the great Abelard once looked out when a 2-year-old niece of the builder of the present cathedral of Notre Dame cast him forward. The conflict existed. They both admitted they did wrong, as Augustine did. But there is not now that clear commitment that Augustine made. But at any rate, the times and the thoughts are close enough to those of Augustine until we come to another. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, born in 1712. One of the makers of the modern world. Unfortunately, his mother died when he was young. Jean-Jacques tells us in his Confessions, it's interesting that he wrote a work entitled Confessions and also a book called Heloise. So we put the three of them together tonight. His mother died when he was young. His father taught him to read. He could read at the age of 5. And his father used to keep him up late at night reading to him lascivious novels. Jean-Jacques says in his Confessions, he said, from my earliest age, I was never able to think. I just felt. Passions made me live. Passions made me die. Later on, he falls in with Madame de Warens. He believes that he's converted. Madame de Warens, however, is not the best influence in the world. Enters political life for a while. Has some difficulties keeping peace with some of his confrères. And then in the year 1749, Jean-Jacques is on his way to visit his friend Diderot in the prison of Vincennes. He had in his pocket a copy of the Mercure de France, in which there was announced in this magazine a prize to be given by the Academy of Dijon on the subject, have the sciences and progress contributed to morals. Jean-Jacques fell asleep under an oak tree as he began thinking how he might write the essay. Being always very sentimental, Jean-Jacques said, "When I awakened, my waistcoat was damp with tears. And there came to me the brilliant idea that nature is good. It is civilization that has made man wicked." In other words, follow the instincts, however base they be. You cannot be accused of being wrong. There's something external that makes you wrong. He called it civilization. Marx would call it capitalism. Freud would call it a nid complex, or father complex, or a mother complex, coming from the id. It made no difference which. For him, civilization has made man wicked, and one must therefore get back as close as one can to nature, not that which constitutes a man intellectually and rationally, but rather nature understood as something primitive. So he took unto himself a common law wife, Teresa Levasseur, who gave birth in the course of time to 5 children, each of which Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Thérèse abandoned at birth. And he wrote a book on how to educate children. He was the beginning of that long group of educators who raise no children but tell everybody else how to raise them. And then Jean-Jacques in his Confessions went on to say, "I believe that in all the world there never has been a more humble man than I. And on Judgment Day, I will be able to challenge anyone who might stand up and say, I am a better man than Jean-Jacques. I do not believe that in all creation there's ever been a more humble man than I. And if I thought that there was a holier man than I in the world, I would commit suicide." This is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who gave us romanticism, who gave us sentimentalism, who gave us the primacy of the ego. He was the type of man who might be seated, for example, at a piano. Here's a composition before him. He strikes the wrong key. But instead of looking at the standard, namely the composition, and hitting the right key, he says, however I feel, that will determine the note that is right. Jean-Jacques, therefore, gave birth to an entirely new concept of how to handle the conflict, namely give way to it and call it right. You see, here we've gone a long ways from the confessions of Augustine, Abelard, and Heloise. In those other days, and still with people who are sane and rational, when they do anything wrong, the cuts are clean, almost like the Red Sea that has been parted. You can see the flesh on either side, and the blood is pure. Those are the wounds and the sins of normal people, but here, with Jean-Jacques Rousseau and those who have followed in this primacy of the sentiment and the denial of reason, the wounds are like cancer underneath. And all that people can deal with are merely the effects of something that is hidden. And it's these hidden wounds that cause so many of the ills of our modern world. And yet, Augustine had given the answer before. It makes no difference how late it be when one begins to clean out the wounds. When he does finally clean them, he can say, as Augustine said when he was transformed, too late, O ancient.
Friends, this is the 9th anniversary of our first television show. We're back again with our angel who will clean our blackboards, and this year the angel even opens and closes the door. And we trust that though this is the 9th year, that the sheen will not wear off. You know what Benjamin Franklin once said, that, and we trust it's not true of television, that fish and visitors both smell after 3 days. Just before the show, we were testing the loudspeaker. And there came to my mind a story about Senator O'Gorman, years ago here in New York. He had deep stentorian tones that could be heard in the uttermost bounds of the old Madison Square Garden. And he was talking on a political subject. And this particular night, 3 members of the political opposition came in, and they sat on the front row, where they could hear the senator very well. And finally, the senator began warming up, filling the garden with his voice. And one of these inebriates, for one of them, all 3 rather, were in a state of amiable incandescence. One of them leaned back and said, "Louder." And the second, "Louder." The third, "Louder." And O'Gorman, the skilled orator, not to be disconcerted, immediately began talking about the Last Judgment. And he said, "And on the last day the Lord will send forth his angels, spreading death, fire, disease, and destruction upon the earth. They will descend into the valley of Jehoshaphat, separate the sheep from the goats, the good from the bad. And as he mounts the golden throne of judgment, to pronounce eternal sentences of condemnation and righteousness, some drunken fools from Albany will stand up and say, 'Louder, louder, louder.'" This subject is the psychoanalytic couch. Couches are very important in our modern mental world, but I'm going to tell you the story of 2 couches. The first couch. The first couch became rather important thanks to Sigmund Freud, who did so much to popularize the method of psychoanalysis. Freud used to sit at the head of a couch, rather hidden from his patient, in order that his personality would not be too much emphasized, and then he would query the patient on the couch. Now, this first couch, of which we are to speak, was characterized by these 3 factors. First of all, the patient was on the couch. And the psychoanalyst at the head of it. Secondly, the patient was passive. That is to say, he was to deliver his own thoughts in relationship to questions that were asked. The patient, as it were, took his medicine lying down. The thoughts were, to a great extent, inspired by the questions of the psychoanalyst. I heard of a woman who called up a friend of hers and said, "My husband is going to divorce me." And she said, "Well, so what? What do you think about it?" Well, she said, "I don't know what to think. I haven't consulted my psychoanalyst." But she got well enough so she was able to sit up on the side of the couch. Now, the patient was passive. And then thirdly, on this couch, there is no guilt, no sin. One never does anything wrong. One may have a complex, but one has never committed a sin. And the reason is this. According to this theory that uses the couch, man has, first of all, what is called a superego. That superego is made up of all of the ideals of his society, convention, religion, morals, taboos, social pressures, and the like. Down beneath his consciousness, this is consciousness, is his subconsciousness, which is called the id, ID. The id is a Latin word, it means that. That's all, just that. In this id or cellar, or subconsciousness, there is a basic drive, which is called the pleasure principle. Now picture, therefore, some stairs going up, as it were, to the superego. The pleasure principle, particularly sex, strives to assert itself. So it comes up the stairs. But up at the top of the stairs, the superego, convention, society, morals, and taboos, has stationed a little censor. That's a censor. And this censor will repress this drive. Sometimes this drive can be repressed so much that there develops what is called a guilt complex. One therefore becomes abnormal as a result of that repression. Now that's one couch and what takes place on it. Now another couch. And here we go back 20 centuries. In order to understand this particular couch, remember that in those days, people did not sit at table as we do with chairs, nor did they sit cross-legged, flat on the floor, at a low table, as do some Orientals. Rather, they reclined on couches. In the dining room in those days, the Romans used that kind of a dining room, the Persians and the Egyptians, and the Jews, after the captivity, used it too. Now, the dining room was called a triclinia. It was called a triclinia because the table, as it were, had three sides. And from one side of the table, and from each side, there were couches. The head of the person would be here, and the feet here. Now, this might be the host, here. Then others would have their couches. They would lean on their left side, leaving their right hand free to eat from the table. Sometimes when I am tired at table, I often wish they would revive the idea of couches. Sandals would be taken off, and the result was that the feet were bare on the couch. Food was served from this end of the table. Here was very often the street. And this door sometimes was open. There would be only a curtain there. It was not uncommon for people to walk into strangers' dining rooms. Some would peek behind the curtain. For example, the Pharisees did that once because it was said that when they saw our blessed Lord eating with Pharisees, or rather with publicans, the Pharisees asked the disciples, "Why does he do this?" So they had evidently drawn aside the curtain. Then people would wander into the dining room and they would sit along the wall and listen to the conversation. The host this particular time, on his couch, was a Pharisee. That is to say, he was a rigorist, very strict, more than puritanical, and he had invited our blessed Lord to dinner. Very likely our blessed Lord might have been at his right. Now he invited him to dinner because he was fond of lionizing strangers, because also he wanted to find out if he was just an ordinary teacher. He neglected to show certain common courtesies, however. But the Lord let that pass for the moment. And there came now, from behind the curtain, an intruder. What Simon saw brought a blush to his cheek. He would not have minded it if anyone else had been there. But the master, what would he think of it? The intruder was a woman. Her name is not mentioned. Her profession is. She was a sinner. A woman of the streets. She did not just happen to wander in. Nor was she there because she had heard village gossip about the divine master being there. She knew it, and she came deliberately. She had probably heard the words that he had said the day before. Come to me, all ye that labor and are heavily burdened, and find rest for your soul. Her hair was down. It was long. She did not attempt to brush it away from her eyes. It acted as a screen against the gaze of the Pharisee. And she came to a couch. And this time, the analyst is on the couch. Our blessed Lord. The woman comes and stands at his feet. She is not passive. She is active. And she lets fall upon those sandaled harbingers of peace, like the first warm drops of a summer rain, a few tears. And then, ashamed at what she has done, she tries to wipe them away with her hair. St. Paul said the glory of a woman is her long hair. Many women who would wander off the streets today couldn't do that. But the fountain of tears would not be stopped. There was guilt in her soul. She had a sense of sin. And then she kisses his feet. She smothers them with kisses. God, in the form of man, can take these manifestations of affection without in any way being hurt by their barbed fire. And then there's not only sin, there's not only a deep sense of it and sorrow expressed before this person who was not just a teacher. That's all Simon wanted to find out, if he was a teacher. She knew him better. He was a savior. And so she takes now a vessel, an alabaster vessel of perfume. Women used to carry alabaster vessels about their necks. We know one woman at that time who spent 1/10 of her dowry on perfume. Another woman had $1,500 worth of perfume in her alabaster vase about her neck. You think smell number 5 is expensive? I tell you, this woman who came in was carrying something much more precious. And she did not pour it out drop by drop, as if to signify by the slowness of her giving, the generosity of her gift. She broke the vessel, gave everything. For love knows no limits. What sweet music was struck from that lyre of the alabaster vase. And now, the man on the couch, Simon, passive all the time, he turns analyst. And he begins to analyze the creator and master of the world. Think of it. Oh, those who were always judging, even the divine. Simon only thinks, does not speak. He merely thought within himself, if he were a prophet, he would know the kind of woman it is that touches him, that she is a sinner. How did he know? And our Lord read his thoughts. in anticipation of judgment, and said to him, Simon, I have a word for thy hearing. Tell it, master. Superficial indifference. Master, that's all he is. And our blessed Lord then said to him, a certain man had 2 debtors. The one owed him 500 pence, pieces of silver, and the other owed him 50 pieces of silver. Having not wherewith to pay, he forgave them both. Which of the 2, Simon, think you loved him the more? Simon said, I suppose the one who had the greater debt discharged. Thou hast answered rightly, Simon. And if many sins are forgiven her, she has also loved much. Our Lord was saying to Simon, Simon, you are judging yourself by that woman when you ought to be judging yourself by me. You're like people who want to hear of scandals and evil deeds of others in order that your own life may not seem so black and foul. Yes, she's the greater sinner, 10 times greater. She's the 500 pieces of silver, you're only the 50. But neither of you have the wherewith to pay. You're both debtors to me. I am the one who pays the debt. There is such a thing in the world as guilt, and I will pay it. Then the Lord went on to say how much